Professor Yano here, Dr. Steve Yano here with you again, public speaking. Welcome from where you're from. Hopefully you're just in my online public speaking class. I don't know why else you'd be watching this. Maybe you made a deal with a prosecutor or something for some crime and you have to watch these videos. I don't know. But anyway, I'm a fool because it's like after 4 o'clock and I thought I'd have a cup of coffee. Oh yeah, it's just, can you see that? It's so nice. Nothing like a hot steaming cup of coffee for a hot steaming rhetoric lecture, like they've always said. Something's going on outside. I hope you can't hear that. I have a pretty good microphone, so you should be okay. Welcome, Lecture 5, about the tests of evidence. This is going to be a long one, folks. Strap in. It's going to be long. It's going to be kind of intense. I can already feel myself getting excited over it. It's going to be kind of crazy. But nothing hits quite like this talk. I think that the importance of it, the importance of being able to see the support someone's giving you for a reason that you should believe or feel or think or do something, and being able to unpack that and say, I don't agree with you, and here's why. It's based on your evidence, the evidence that you have presented. Ooh. Oh, look at how shiny I look. That's pretty decent lighting there. Anyway, it probably wouldn't be that long of a lecture if I actually prepared a little bit ahead of time. So what I'm going to be covering in this talk is what's traditionally called the tests of evidence. The tests of evidence are questions that you can ask to the supporting reasons or material that people provide to you in a speech in order to see if it's really the best it could be. Now, these are guidelines. These are not silver bullets. The biggest problem we have in argument, the biggest problem we have in reasoning, in public reasoning, like people giving speeches to try to get somebody to vote for somebody or convince somebody that some policy is the right one to do. The biggest problem we have is we're looking for silver bullet practices. That would mean, what I mean by that is we're looking for one question or one technique or one method that will eliminate all lies and deception and only allow the truth through. Huge problems with this way of thinking. First, most of the time when we are trying to convince other people how to feel or think or act, we do not know the truth. We think we know what is right and best and good to do, but we probably don't know what's going to happen. Even if we're talking about the past, we don't know what happened. Think about courtroom rhetoric. Courtroom legal rhetoric is set up in a way to make sure that we get the most objective possible hearing of the evidence so that we can decide what happened and what the legal remedy should be. Not the truth, but what is legally the conclusion that should happen. What's the remedy? Should someone go to jail? Should someone pay a fine? Should someone pay you a bunch of money for their negligence? What should it be? So that's a far cry from the way we imagine and talk about it to each other. So think about that. Silver bullet methods don't exist. What we have are tests that we can do to say, well, I probably shouldn't believe that because it failed this test of evidence. Probably. But you have to always look at the context, always look at the situation, look at what's available and see, is that the best evidence available? What the tests of evidence are meant to do is say, is this evidence the best available, or is there a problem with it in some way? Which means we have to draw the claim into the realm of suspicion. We have to withhold agreement. See how I'm talking about that? It's much more moderate than what you hear on the news or what you hear from society these days, where the predilection that people have is to say, oh, you're wrong. And then from there, you're stupid. You're an idiot for believing that. Can't people just be mistaken because they were led by evidence that was maybe more compelling than it should be? I've made that mistake. You've probably made that mistake. So the tests of evidence are not an offensive weapon. They're protective measures like shop goggles, or in chemistry lab, you wear the goggles and the white coat. You know, why do lab people wear a white coat? Because a white coat will show if it's been hit by anything, any kind of foreign material. A darker coat might not show that. You might leave the lab with something toxic on you. You got to know if you have something on you. So think about this as the goggles and the white coat for participating in rhetoric. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to be something you wield like a cudgel and lop off the heads of people who are trying to convince you of something they're wrong. People use fallacies like this too. We'll get to that when I give a fallacy lecture later on. But people use fallacies like that too. They think fallacies are like some kind of weapon. They're like, oh, you've committed a fallacy. Okay, done for. That's not how it should work at all. Mistakes are made because we're human. We're making decisions and arguments in language, which we all know language is flawed, limited. It's composed of gaps. It's composed of assumed meanings. It's composed of practices that we may or may not culturally share. Have you ever said something, used the wrong word, and really offended somebody? Or use a word that you think is neutral, and they were like, how dare you? It's really harsh. And you have to backpedal probably for days sometimes. Sometimes for the rest of your life, you have to backpedal. Use the wrong word. Language is imprecision is why language is so beautiful, though. That's how we're able to have poetry and songs and all that beautiful stuff that we like. So don't think of these as like right or wrong binary kinds of things. The first thing I think we should do is look at the handout. So this is available on, it's just called Tests of Evidence, Flood and Cripe. This is from a book called The Scholastic Debater. You know, tests of evidence really don't appear in public speaking books, but they really should, because we have to use evidence in public speaking all the time, not just in debates, not just in arguments, but anytime we're giving a speech, we need to provide evidence of why the audience should listen to us, why we're presenting them with value, why they should think about what we're saying, and why they should agree or feel or do or be the thing we want them to be when we speak. All right, let's take a look. The first question, does the evidence meet the test of quantity? Quantity refers to number, okay? So, okay, I sound like that guy on South Park, the teacher on South Park sometimes when I'm making these videos. I hope not. The test of quantity, how many? Is there more than one piece of evidence to support the contention? Sometimes people will just take one number and think that's enough. It should be questioned. But again, you know, it depends on the context. But is one enough? Generally not. It's good to have a couple of different pieces of evidence. Is it a sufficient number? Sometimes one is not the loneliest number. It's actually a sufficient good number for something. Is the sample of adequate size and scope? This is one that gets people all the time. What does this mean? Is the sample adequate size and scope? If you want to say something about a population, you need to have surveyed or asked a number of that population that percentage-wise meets or exceeds what we could say the entire population feels. If you're going to do a survey of what most Democrats think or what most Republicans think, you have to ask Republicans not just in the South, but in the North and in the West and the East. So size, the amount of people asked, or the amount of cases, and scope. Is it all concentrated in one place? Because you might say, this is a serious problem affecting millions of people in Indiana. Okay, well, the audience is going to be like, well, that's not affecting everyone. And headlines do this to you all the time. There's a great headline recently where I saw this on like Microsoft News, MSN News or something. You know, like when you open your browser and you're like an old person like me, it just gives you this page of like propagandistic news. And it said, mask mandates are back. And it had a picture of Joe Biden. And someone I know saw this and thought, oh my God, we're going back into mask mandates. This is awful. When you click on the story, it talked about there were 2 schools in Texas. Schools, high schools, not even the whole school district, where there were so many acute COVID cases, the school issued a mask mandate for the students and the teachers there. Now, that's bad evidence, right? It's not adequate size and scope to conclude that we should all be worried about a national mask mandate. Is there more than one source of evidence? So you might have 2 statistics or 2 pieces of evidence, but do they come from 2 different sources? It's better to have it come from 2 different sources rather than just one. So there's a problem with that one source, then all the evidence in that source is going to be a problem, and maybe a reason why people are going to pause before they take in what it is you're trying to help them understand or do or feel. Is there a diversity of sources? That is, does it come from multiple different kinds of news outlets? So does this coming from just cable news channels, or is it coming from different kinds of publications? So I always think, you know, if it comes from a good newspaper, international newspaper, magazine, different places, that would be good. Diversity of sources. I don't know how this would go for YouTube videos. What would that mean? Well, some YouTubers we know try to make mountains out of molehills, should we say? They'll take a rumor and they'll make a 15-minute video on like something that's assumed. And maybe they'll make a second video on that same topic. That wouldn't be diversity of source. Diversity of source might be a YouTuber, and then maybe an article in a newspaper magazine about it. Now, if you're dealing with celebrity news, it might not be, let's say you're talking about something celebrity-oriented or oriented to film or Hollywood or something. It might not be like the New York Times or Forbes, like a big business magazine covering it. It doesn't mean the evidence is bad if it's not one of those sources. It just means we need to have diverse sources that aren't working together, that don't have the same kind of motive, if that makes sense to you. Is this an isolated example or a typical case? So we want to ask that and say, could this example happen in other places? So when someone presents evidence or you're presenting evidence, make sure that you have an answer for that and that you've shown that it's typical. Okay, let's say you're not dealing with evidence that's numbers at all. You're dealing with quality, evidence that's quality-based, which is a little bit different. Quality is how intensely it's felt or how horrible it is for a person, regardless of number. Yeah, my phone is blowing up. Has it ever happened to you while you're in the middle of something, your phone is blowing up? At least have it on silent, but lots of messages coming in right now. It must be because of that last lecture. Did you see it? Lecture number 4? Lecture the 4th? I should title them that way. That would be kind of cooler. Lecture the 4th. Lecture the 4th. Lecture the 5th. I vanished. This might be a little bit better for sort of seeing, taking a look at the handout, but I kind of miss you guys seeing me. Kind of one of those things where I'm like, oh, I don't feel like I'm a part of the class. Okay, there I am again. Quality is the intensity or the not numeric value of the evidence you're talking about. So is the source credible? How do we determine a source is credible? That depends on the source. Are they credible? So if it's a newspaper, we need to look at newsworthiness, editorial standards, all that kind of stuff. Let me show you something here really quick. I didn't really plan to do this, but you know, in the last video, we were talking about the New York Times and how people think the New York Times is, they might not like it because they think it's too liberal. Here's the New York Times. I want to show you something here. In the New York Times, they have a place you can go where you can take a look at their editorial policies. Where is it? All the different corrections, how they handle corrections, because, you know, sometimes they make mistakes. So here they are making a statement. I can't read it because I didn't pay them, which kind of sucks. But the New York Times has they have a statement on their policies. Yeah, this is about the website. It's not really what I wanted. But most of these news sites will have a site where they say, here's what we think is our editorial policy. Here's what we think. What do we determine news is? Behind the journalism, how the Times works. I think this is what I'm looking for. Okay, yeah, this is great. This is a statement of their ethics. So this might be a way to determine if they are a little bit more trustworthy or not. Might be something you could think of. And look for that for your sources. Is the source credible? Are they transparent with how they do things? Is the source trained in research? So sometimes people will say, here's what I think looking at it, but they might not have the skills or the research acumen to make the kind of claims they're making. Has the source made a study? Did they do a study themselves, or are they just looking at data from the news or data that's accessible on the internet? It's always better to have better information that you looked at specifically for the study rather than scraping it. So you want to think about that. Is the source prejudiced? That is, do they have some kind of a bias or some kind of an assumption about the way the world works or how it goes? And this can go down pretty far. So you don't really need to dig that deeply, but sometimes you might want to, about whether the source is biased or prejudiced for things to turn out a certain way or not. Is the source speaking against his or her own interests or beliefs? Now, this is one that's going to appear in the Newman and Newman as well, which is the idea that if someone is speaking about in a way that harms themselves, they're probably a little bit more credible. That's usually how it goes. But somebody speaking about their own interests or beliefs, it might be too ridiculous to consider. And therefore, you might want to question why they might be doing that. Is the source noted for reliability? That is, do they have a history of being reliable and talking about things that are verifiable and have veracity, that are true, that are factually based in research? Is the source consistent with previous statements or findings? So this is one where you could say, okay, that's weird. I'm going to go look up. This is why it's good to be an active listener. So when you're consuming media, or you're listening to speeches on TED, or you're listening to people on YouTube, you might want to be Googling what they're saying. And this goes for professors too. You might want to be looking up what they're saying and say, does this agree? Does this have consistency with other research out there? Or is this something that just kind of stands on its own? You have to be careful with that, because sometimes researchers have, they're talking about something that they've been researching or publishing, but there should be data out there that would corroborate with what they're saying. Is the source in agreement with other reputable authorities in the field? Sometimes in our day and age, we think that because something is outside of what most of the authorities say, it's more true. That is a very bad way of reasoning. The authorities in the field, and fields are determined by ethics standards, research standards, standards of what good information is, standards of what publishable information is. Because experts realize in expertise communities that if they say something wrong, or they get something wrong, or if they say something too extreme, or without the proper amount of detail or the proper amount of weight to it, they could cause a lot of problems. They could cause hysteria, panic. They could cause a lot of people to be hurt. So what they do is they're very careful about that. So it's not the case that if something's a minority opinion or just a few people are saying it, that it means it's more believable than the mainstream authorities. The mainstream authorities are boring. They're not very exciting. They're not going to be on Joe Rogan because they're not going to get attention. They're going to say things that we kind of already know. The big jumps in research are not going to happen in extreme ways to be like, everything we know for the last 20 years is wrong. Now, that makes a great podcast headline or news headline, but it's certainly not good information. So we want to make sure there's some agreement with things like ethics, research standards, what's a good study, all of that. So it's the same with news organizations too. How do they source their news? What counts as a story? How do they determine the ethics of a story? How do you treat anonymous sources? All those things. And are there negative instances? How many negative instances can you find about this evidence that shows that it's actually the other way around? That requires some research on your part, but sometimes somebody's speaking, you think, I can think of 5 or 6 counter examples. That might be a way to push back and say, maybe I shouldn't agree with this so quickly. Maybe I need more. Maybe I need to look into it more. Or maybe there's something wrong about how I'm thinking about it or how they're thinking about it. But it's not a silver bullet like they're wrong, I'm right, or I'm wrong, they're right. It's not that. It's we got to put the brakes on. That's the point of tests of evidence. We got to put the brakes on and reconsider our assent to this proposition. It's kind of a fantasy that somebody's going to listen to you speak and then suddenly just agree with you. Not going to happen. Okay, is it capable of passing the recency test? Is the material cited of a recent date, the most recent date of which would be? I should change that to of which would be, because recency is important for things like political opinions, controversies, things that are most recent in research. But sometimes the recency might be of a date that's more recent to the issue you're talking about. So if you wanted to do like some scandal about BTS or something, you might say the last posting was on this date, and since then there hasn't been another posting, so that means that this has been resolved. That'd be the kind of claim you're making with recency. Since there haven't been any other posts, this might have been resolved, right? Because no one's talking about it anymore. Pretty compelling claim. What's the most recent date? So sometimes people would say, if they're citing something from 10 years ago, and they're talking about climate change, that's suspect. Or they're talking about democratic policy, suspect, right? So it makes you raise your eyebrows, listen a little bit more critically and carefully. Is the publication date a true indication of the recency of the material? So sometimes people will republish something or publish it in April of 2023 and say this was originally published in February of 2004. Got to look for that. Look carefully. The recency of the material might not be when it was put on someone's blog or when a YouTuber picked it up. It might be from 20 years ago. Now, that might not have bearing, but it should be looked at because it could have bearing on whether or not you want to agree, feel, think, or do something the speaker is asking you to do. Or when you're trying to find good information, You want to look for things that are maybe reposted and not the most actual recent research that's out there. Is the evidence capable of passing the relevance test? Okay. What is relevance? That means the information could be good, but it might not be connected to the thing they're trying to get you to think about, feel about, do or be or whatever. Does the evidence presented really prove the conclusion drawn from it? That is there a straight line you can say from the evidence to the conclusion? Sometimes the evidence is very good, but it doesn't really support the conclusion. You have to look for that. So we do have to be careful with that. We have to be careful about that connection. What's the line between the evidence and the conclusion? It might not be there. And that might be a reason to put the brakes on, pump the brakes. So when we're thinking about test of evidence, we're thinking about pumping the brakes. This is an example of few, some, many, or all. What's the intensity of that information? Is this just for a few people? Relevant for a few, relevant for some, many, all? Does it impact everyone? And a good rhetor can make it impact everyone. So you want to look at that information and say, well, that's a conclusion they're drawing from it, but maybe there's another conclusion we could draw if we look carefully at the connection between the evidence, the reasons presented, and the conclusion they want us to buy into. If it's opinion evidence, now what is opinion evidence? That would be an expert saying, in my opinion, da-da-da-da-da, or a poll of people saying, well, in my opinion, I think Joe Biden's too old to be president, or whatever it might be that you're talking about. If it's opinion evidence, does it present a reasonable interpretation of the evidence? So if doctors are saying, we're not going to prescribe this drug because we think it's dangerous, a reasonable interpretation might be the drug is dangerous and you should advocate for it being banned. Now, that might be a reasonable interpretation, but we'd have to look carefully at the opinion evidence. Usually, if someone's offering opinion evidence, it's going to be an expert's opinion evidence, usually, because they're trying to sway you. They're trying to get you to believe something. So that's usually what they mean by, is that a reasonable interpretation? Did I bring it across in a way? And think about that when you're offering opinion evidence as well. Or the opinion of an expert who might not be a schooled expert, but somebody who has a lot of experience. It would be the same thing. Is that experience connect in a relevant way? If it's a quotation has been altered to make it more relevant, always look for ... You know what the ... is in any quote is an ellipsis. And that means part of that quote was left out. Usually they'll say for space, but sometimes it could be relevant. Sometimes people make the mistake of looking at an academic book or a book that's making a compelling argument, and the person will spend a few paragraphs at the beginning of a chapter saying, Smith says da-da-da, Smith says this, and Smith makes the argument that da-da-da-da. Then at the end they'll say, I completely disagree with Smith. Well, sometimes people aren't very schooled about how to read this. They might just take those paragraphs and say, this author agrees with Smith. But then if you look down the page, they'll say, well, I brought this up because Smith couldn't be more wrong about what they're saying. And they just leave that part out, or maybe they're not. They didn't read far enough in the book. It's a big, embarrassing thing to happen. But sometimes people are malicious, and they'll leave out, the next line or the next paragraph where it says, I completely disagree with all of this. Okay, that can be pretty telling. That's somebody you probably shouldn't listen to at all if they do that. Are the statistics quoted relevant to the argument? Why is statistics capitalized? That is, statistics could be put in there like, hey, most people throw away batteries that are still good. And that's why I think recycling is a huge failure. Okay, how's that relevant? They're going to need to explain why that means that recycling is a huge failure. Why should I feel that small-scale recycling is a huge failure just because people throw away good batteries? What's the connection there? I need to ask after that. I don't need to agree with somebody. And they'll say, well, I have this statistic. It's not good enough, man. Not good enough, bro. You need more. Is a sample of adequate size and scope? This is the same as above. Do compared units of measurement differ? Now, sometimes this can get you on graphs and other things like that. Households to individuals. Are we talking about schools? Or are we talking about classrooms? Sometimes people will mess this up in statistics. So look at those compared units of measure. If people are talking about school districts and they switch to schools, or people are talking about families and they switch to individuals, these are the most common kinds of statistical manipulation that can happen. So when those differ, that means the results differ. So one pretest might be looking at school districts in a reading program. The conclusions might look at particular classrooms afterwards. The speaker or the person offering that as evidence that we need to do something or believe something, that a reading program works, for example, they are on the hook for explaining that difference. And it's a fair question to ask, and it's a fair reason to hesitate in agreement with them. And do the statistics measure the particular item at issue? So sometimes statistics might measure something else completely, or maybe not be a relevant measure at all. All right, so in video 6, this video's gone on long enough. This is the test of evidence handout. If you went with this, you'd be great, but I also want you to look at the Newman and Newman, primarily because Newman and Newman is just such an amazing artifact of evidence evaluation. It has so much to it. That's going to be a longer video. That'll be video 6, will be Newman and Newman test of evidence. But this will be good for you if you just want the kind of the basics. I think if you went with this and tested your sources or used this for your critical listening practice, you'd be in good shape. So anyway, this has been lecture 5. Believe it or not, I'll see you guys in the next lecture. More tests of evidence to come. Oh, yes. Let me test that evidence. Give me some.